April 12, 1946. A mild spring morning on the Callaway Ranch outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. Keiko Yamada stood in the converted barn that had served as her prison for 5 months, staring at ranch foreman Thomas Callaway with an expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The tall cowboy shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his weathered hands turning his hat in nervous circles. Behind Keiko, 36 other Japanese women POWs had stopped their morning chores to witness what would become one of the most unexpected conversations in the history of wartime captivity. Mr. Callaway had just asked them to teach him and his ranch hands how to make sushi. The request hung in the cold Wyoming air like something from a fever dream. Keiko's English had improved dramatically over the winter months, but surely she had misunderstood. She glanced at Haruko Tanaka, the former naval translator who had become their unofficial spokesperson. Haruko's dark eyes reflected the same bewilderment. They had prepared themselves for many things when they were captured in the Pacific Theater. Interrogation, harsh treatment, even execution in those first terrifying days. They had not prepared for American cowboys politely requesting lessons in traditional Japanese cuisine. Mr. Callaway seemed to sense their confusion. He explained in his slow, careful way that he had been reading about Japanese culture in a magazine from Denver. The article had described sushi and other traditional foods, and it had made him curious. More than that, he said, he wanted to understand the women who had been living on his family's ranch for nearly half a year. He wanted to know who they really were. Beyond the designation of enemy prisoners, the other ranch hands stood behind him, young men and older cowboys alike, their faces showing genuine interest rather than mockery. Keiko found herself unable to respond. The absurdity of the moment was overwhelming. Here they stood, women who had served the Imperial Japanese Navy, captured during the final desperate months of the war, now being asked to share their culture with the very men who guarded them. The Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly beyond the barn doors, so unlike the rice paddies and coastal villages of their homeland. And this American, this cowboy with dirt under his fingernails and kindness in his weathered face, wanted to learn about sushi in Wyoming, in landlocked, beef-eating, rodeo-loving Wyoming. But as Keiko looked around at her fellow prisoners, she saw something unexpected in their expressions. Not just confusion, but something else. Interest, perhaps even the faintest hint of hope. They had lost so much. Their country, their families, their identities as soldiers of a defeated empire. Maybe, just maybe, sharing something of themselves could help them remember who they had been before the war convinced them they were something else entirely. November 9, 1945. 6 months earlier, before the impossible request, before the tentative friendships, before everything changed. The military transport truck rumbled along the rutted dirt road toward the Callaway Ranch, carrying 37 Japanese women who had no idea where they were being taken or what would happen when they arrived. Keiko pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching glimpses of a landscape so foreign it might as well have been another planet. Endless brown prairie stretched toward distant mountains, nothing like the green islands and coastal cities of Japan. The vastness of it made her feel impossibly small. The women had been captured 3 months earlier during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific War. Most had served as communications specialists, translators, or administrative support for Imperial Japanese naval operations in the Philippines and Okinawa. They were not combat soldiers, but they wore uniforms and had taken oaths of service. When American forces overran their positions, they had expected execution. Instead, they found themselves on ships bound for the American mainland, processed through facilities in California, and now transported to this remote location that seemed designed to make them disappear from the world entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the Army officer assigned to oversee the facility, stood waiting as the truck pulled up to the converted barn. She was one of only 3 women in the military administration of the entire Wyoming region, a fact that had made her the obvious choice for this unprecedented assignment. The Army had no protocol for housing female enemy prisoners. Male POW camps dotted the American landscape, holding thousands of Germans and Italians, But Japanese women prisoners were rare enough that standard procedures simply did not exist. So the military had requisitioned the Callaway Ranch, paid the family generously for the use of their largest barn and surrounding buildings, and told Colonel Mitchell to figure it out. The women climbed down from the truck with rigid military bearing, their dark hair pinned severely, their threadbare naval auxiliary uniforms still worn with pride despite months of captivity. Keiko was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. She had joined the Naval Communications Corps in 1943, believing the propaganda that Japan was fighting a defensive war against Western aggression. Now her country lay in ruins, two cities vaporized by weapons that seemed to come from nightmare rather than reality, and she stood in enemy territory with no idea if anyone from her family had survived. Haruko Tanaka stepped forward as the senior-ranking member of their group. At 32, she had been a career naval officer, fluent in English from her education at a Christian missionary school before the war. She addressed Colonel Mitchell in careful, formal English, requesting information about their status and treatment. The colonel's response was professional but not unkind. They would be housed in the converted barn, provided with adequate food and clothing, and expected to follow camp regulations. Beyond that, she admitted, the situation remained unclear. The first 3 weeks passed in frozen silence. The converted barn had been divided into sleeping quarters, a common area, and a small kitchen facility. The women moved through their daily routines like ghosts, speaking only in whispered Japanese when absolutely necessary. They lined up for meals with military precision, ate without complaint, and returned to their quarters to sit in rigid posture on their cots. At night, Keiko could hear muffled crying from various corners of the barn, but by morning every face was once again a mask of stoic dignity. The ranch hands assigned to guard duty were unprepared for this kind of responsibility. Buck Callaway, Thomas's younger brother by 3 years, had expected to spend the war years working the family ranch, too old for the first draft calls and too essential to agriculture for the later ones. Now he found himself carrying a rifle he had no intention of using, watching over women who seemed more frightened of him than he was of them. He and the other hands, mostly older men or boys too young for military service, rotated guard shifts with uncomfortable uncertainty. None of them had ever imagined they would be jailers. The women had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant torture and dishonor worse than death. Every morning, when they woke to find themselves still alive and unmolested, it confused them. Keiko watched the guards carefully, trying to reconcile the propaganda she had absorbed with the reality before her eyes. These men looked nothing like the demons from the posters back home. They looked tired. They looked like farmers and ranchers who wanted to be anywhere but here. Some of them were barely older than her youngest brother, who had died at Okinawa. Colonel Mitchell visited twice weekly, inspecting conditions and attempting to establish some kind of rapport with the prisoners. She brought newspapers, all in English, which Haruko translated for the others. The news was devastating. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The emperor himself had spoken on the radio, his divine voice heard by common people for the first time, telling them the war was lost. Cities across Japan had been burned to ash by American firebombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki no longer existed. The women listened to these translations in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of their nation's defeat. The ranch itself stretched across thousands of acres of Wyoming grassland, bordered by mountains that turned purple in the evening light. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way that made Keiko's heart ache. She had grown up near Yokohama, where the sea met crowded streets and cherry trees bloomed pink each spring. This endless brown prairie felt like exile to the edge of existence. The women were allowed to walk within the fenced compound for exercise, always under watch. They moved in small groups, their eyes on the ground, maintaining the invisible walls that kept them separate from their captors and from the overwhelming reality of their situation. December 3, 1945. Buck Callaway noticed the drawings purely by accident. He was walking the fence line of the compound during his afternoon guard rotation when he saw one of the Japanese women kneeling in a sheltered corner near the barn's south wall. She was drawing in the dirt with a stick, her movements precise and deliberate. Buck stopped, keeping his distance so as not to startle her, and watched. The woman was creating an intricate image of a horse, capturing its form with just a few elegant lines in the dust. The skill was unmistakable. Keiko sensed his presence and froze, her hand still holding the stick. She had been so absorbed in the drawing that she had forgotten to maintain her careful awareness of the guards' positions. Now she waited for reprimand, for the stick to be taken away, for some punishment she could not predict. Instead, Buck Calloway did something that would later seem like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a flood of human connection. He walked slowly to the supply shed, retrieved a stub of pencil and several sheets of paper, and brought them to her. He set them on the ground a respectful distance away, nodded once, and returned to his post. Keiko stared at the paper and pencil, as if they might be a trap. She looked up at the guard, but he had his back turned, apparently watching the horizon. Slowly, she reached out and picked up the pencil. The weight of it in her hand felt like holding a piece of her former life. Before the war, she had studied calligraphy and ink painting with her grandmother. Art had been her refuge, her way of making sense of beauty in a world that increasingly made no sense at all. That evening, Haruko approached Keiko with curiosity about the paper she was carefully concealing under her thin mattress. When Keiko explained what had happened, Haruko's expression shifted through several emotions: suspicion first, then confusion, then something that might have been cautious hope. Why would a guard give gifts to a prisoner? What did he expect in return? But Keiko insisted there had been no demand, no suggestion of obligation, just paper and pencil, given and received in silence. Over the following days, Buck noticed that the woman used the paper sparingly, as if it were precious beyond measure. She would draw for only a few minutes each afternoon, always in that same sheltered spot. He began to recognize her among the group, the slight young woman with careful hands and eyes that seemed to carry an ocean of sadness. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. But he knew what it looked like when someone needed a small piece of normalcy in a world turned upside down. His own brother had written letters from the European front, describing how small comforts, a dry pair of socks, a letter from home, a moment of quiet, could mean everything. December 15, 1945. The Wyoming winter arrived with brutal efficiency. The temperature plummeted overnight, and the women woke to find frost coating the inside of the barn windows. Their thin naval uniforms and the single blanket each had been issued were woefully inadequate. Keiko shivered so violently during morning roll call that her teeth chattered audibly. Around her, the other women wrapped their arms around themselves, trying to preserve body heat through sheer will. None of them complained. Complaining would show weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Thomas Calloway stood with Colonel Mitchell during that morning inspection, and even his weathered rancher's face showed concern. These women might be enemy prisoners, but letting them freeze to death was not something his conscience would tolerate. By noon he had made a decision that would require bending several regulations. He ordered his ranch hands to distribute additional blankets from the ranch's own supplies, along with heavy wool socks and extra undershirts that had been destined for donation to returning soldiers. When Colonel Mitchell raised an eyebrow at this unauthorized generosity, Thomas simply said that frozen prisoners could not work, and the Army had specified the women should contribute labor to offset the cost of their maintenance. The arrival of the additional supplies created a moment of confusion among the women. They gathered in the common area as Buck and two other ranch hands brought in armloads of blankets and clothing. Haruko stepped forward to receive the items, her face carefully neutral, but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the first blanket. It was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of cedar and livestock. It smelled like survival. The women distributed the supplies among themselves with quiet efficiency, each receiving 2 blankets and warm underclothing. That night, for the first time since their arrival, the sound of crying from the dark corners of the barn was replaced by the sound of sleep. But the cold taught them more than just the value of wool blankets. It taught them that survival in Wyoming required knowledge they did not possess. The ranch hands, watching the women struggle with the wood stove in their quarters, began offering instruction. Old Jim Patterson, a ranch hand in his 60s who had worked the Callaway land for 40 years, showed them how to properly stack wood for efficient burning, how to bank a fire to last through the night, how to dress in layers to trap warmth. His demonstrations were wordless at first, just slow, careful movements that the women could observe and imitate. Haruko, recognizing an opportunity, began to translate the old man's occasional comments and to ask questions on behalf of the group. Her English, rusty from disuse and never perfectly fluent, became the bridge between two groups of people who had every reason to remain strangers. She asked about the strange dry cold of the high plains, so different from the humid winters of coastal Japan. Jim explained about altitude and moisture, about how the thin air could deceive you into thinking you were warmer than you were. January 1st, 1946. New Year's Day carried different meanings for the Japanese women and their American captors, but both groups felt the weight of it. For the women, the traditional Shogatsu celebration marked the most important holiday of the year, a time for family, for reflection, for welcoming good fortune. This year, they faced it in captivity, separated from everything familiar, uncertain whether their families even existed anymore. For the ranch hands, it was simply the turning of the calendar, a chance to hope that this new year might bring more peace than the last. Keiko woke before dawn and performed a private ritual she had learned from her grandmother. She bathed as thoroughly as the limited facilities allowed, put on the cleanest clothing she possessed, and sat in meditation facing east toward the homeland she might never see again. Around her, other women engaged in their own observances, creating makeshift altars from folded paper and carefully arranged stones. There was no special food, no sake, no mochi rice cakes, no red decorations. But there was intention, and sometimes intention was enough. Thomas Callaway had been watching the women's subdued preparations with curiosity. He asked Haruko about the significance of the day, and she explained as best she could in her careful English. The new year was about renewal, she said, about leaving behind the old and welcoming the new, about honoring ancestors and hoping for blessings. Thomas listened thoughtfully, then disappeared into the ranch house. He returned an hour later with something unexpected. His mother, Eleanor Callaway, followed him carrying a large pot of black-eyed peas and cornbread, traditional Southern New Year's food that Thomas's Louisiana-born grandmother had brought to Wyoming decades earlier. Eleanor Callaway was a formidable woman in her 60s, weathered by ranch life, but unbent by its hardships. She had lost one son to the Pacific War, killed at Guadalcanal in 1943. She had every reason to hate these Japanese women. Instead, she saw them clearly for what they were: young women, far from home, grieving their own losses, trapped by circumstances they had not created. She set the food down in the common area and spoke in her direct way. "In my family, we eat this on New Year's for good luck and prosperity. I figure we could all use some of that this year." The moment hung suspended between acceptance and rejection. Then Haruko bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. Other women followed her lead. Eleanor, uncomfortable with the formality, waved her hand dismissively and began serving portions onto the mismatched plates the facility provided. The women ate cautiously at first, unfamiliar with the flavors, but hunger and the gesture behind the gift made the strange food acceptable. Some even found they enjoyed it. Keiko thought the black-eyed peas had a texture similar to azuki beans, though the seasoning was entirely different. January 23, 1946. Colonel Mitchell arrived with new orders that would fundamentally change the dynamic at the ranch. The Army had decided that the Japanese women prisoners should contribute labor to justify the expense of their maintenance. The work would be voluntary but encouraged. Those who participated would receive small credits that might eventually be converted to funds upon their release. More importantly, the work would give them purpose during the long, uncertain months ahead. Mitchell outlined various tasks available on the ranch: mending equipment, kitchen duties, laundry, basic animal care, and light agricultural preparation for spring planting. Keiko surprised herself by immediately volunteering for work with the horses. She had never been near a horse before coming to Wyoming. In Japan, such animals were rare and expensive, symbols of a bygone samurai era rather than working ranch tools. But something about the creatures called to her. Perhaps it was their size and power contained within gentle eyes. Perhaps it was the way they existed in the present moment, without the burden of memory or anticipation. Whatever the reason, she found herself standing in the stable on a cold morning, facing Buck Calloway and a chestnut mare named Rosie. Buck spoke slowly, explaining that Rosie needed grooming, her stall needed mucking, and her water trough needed refilling. He demonstrated each task with patient movements, aware that Keiko's English was still limited and that horses could sense fear. Keiko watched intently, memorizing each motion. When Buck handed her the curry comb, she approached the mare with the same careful respect she had once shown her grandmother's calligraphy tools. Rosie stood patiently as Keiko's inexperienced hands worked through her coat, removing dried mud and loose hair. The rhythmic motion became meditative, a way to quiet the constant anxiety that had lived in Keiko's chest since her capture. Other women found their own forms of refuge in labor. Michiko Sato, who had been a nurse in the Naval Medical Corps, began working with Eleanor Calloway in the ranch house kitchen, learning to bake bread and prepare the hearty meals that fueled ranch operations. Yuki Nakamura, who had maintained communications equipment during the war, discovered she had a talent for repairing the ranch's aging machinery. She could diagnose problems with engines and tools through careful observation, even without understanding the English manuals. Thomas Calloway found himself increasingly relying on her skill with mechanical systems. The work transformed more than just the women's daily routines. It changed how the ranch hands perceived them. When you worked alongside someone, shared the burden of physical labor, you stopped seeing them as abstract enemies and started seeing them as individuals. Jim Patterson, mucking out stalls beside Keiko one morning, began teaching her the names of tools and animals in English. She taught him how to count to 10, in Japanese in return. The exchange was simple, practical, and somehow profound. They were building something neither could have articulated, a foundation of shared humanity beneath the weight of war and nationality, and official designations of prisoner and guard. February 14, 1946. The mail delivery arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carried by a military courier from the processing center in Denver. Colonel Mitchell sorted through the stack with careful attention, her face growing more somber with each envelope she examined. 23 letters for the Japanese women prisoners, routed through international Red Cross channels and military censors. After months of silence, after months of not knowing, some of the women would finally learn what had become of their families. The anticipation in the barn that evening was almost unbearable. Haruko received 3 letters, more than anyone else. Her hand shook as she opened the first, from a cousin who had survived the firebombing of Tokyo. The letter was brief, factual, devastating. Haruko's parents had died in the March 1945 raid that killed over 100,000 people in a single night. Her younger sister had survived, but was living in a refugee camp with inadequate food and shelter. Her brother's status remained unknown. He had been stationed in Manchuria when the Soviets invaded. Haruko read the letter twice, her face perfectly still, then carefully folded it and placed it in her pocket. She did not cry. Not yet. Not where others could see. Keiko received 1 letter, forwarded multiple times through various military channels, the envelope worn soft from handling. It was from an aunt in Osaka, who had somehow survived the conventional bombing raids that had destroyed most of that city. The news was worse than Keiko had allowed herself to imagine. Her parents and younger brother had been in Hiroshima visiting relatives in early August 1945. They were among the estimated 200,000 people killed by the atomic bomb and its aftermath. Her older brother had died in the Philippines in 1944. Her aunt wrote that she was the last surviving member of her immediate family. The aunt herself was dying of radiation sickness contracted while searching for survivors in Hiroshima's ruins. 14 women received no letters at all. The silence was in some ways worse than devastating news. It meant uncertainty, the torture of not knowing whether to hope or grieve. Yuki Nakamura sat on her cot staring at nothing, her practical hands idle for once. Her family had lived in Nagasaki. The complete absence of any word suggested the worst, but without confirmation, she existed in a painful limbo between hope and despair. Several other women faced similar situations, their hometowns in the paths of the American bombing campaigns, their families' fates unknown and perhaps unknowable. That night, the ranch hands heard sounds from the barn they had not heard before. Not the muffled crying of early captivity, but open, unrestrained grief. Women who had maintained rigid composure for months finally broke under the weight of confirmed loss. Buck Calloway stood outside on guard duty, listening to the sounds of hearts shattering, and found tears running down his own weathered face. He thought of his brother killed at Guadalcanal, of his mother's grief that had eventually hardened into survival. War created these losses on both sides, he realized. The women in that barn were grieving the same war that had taken his brother, just from the other direction. April 12, 1946. 2 months after the devastating letters, the women had settled into a fragile new equilibrium. They worked. They endured. They found small moments of peace in daily routines, but the grief still lived in their eyes, visible to anyone who looked closely. Thomas Calloway had been looking closely. He had watched these women transform from rigid prisoners into weary laborers into something approaching members of his ranch community. He had also watched them carry their losses with a dignity that humbled him. He wanted to do something, anything, to acknowledge their humanity beyond the basic provisions required by military regulations. He had been reading a Saturday Evening Post article about occupied Japan, trying to understand the country his brother had died fighting against. The article described Japanese culture, traditions, and food. One section discussed sushi, raw fish prepared with vinegared rice, a dish the author claimed was both art and sustenance. Thomas found himself fascinated by the idea of food as artistic expression, so different from the practical, calorie-focused approach to eating he had grown up with on the ranch. He wondered if creating something from their own culture might help the women remember who they had been before the war had defined them. The idea seemed absurd even as it formed in his mind. Sushi. In Wyoming. They were hundreds of miles from any ocean, in a land of cattle and wheat and unforgiving prairie. But absurdity had never stopped Thomas Calloway from trying something he believed was right. He consulted with Buck, who pointed out that the ranch had access to trout from mountain streams, not ocean fish, but fish nonetheless. Thomas then did something unprecedented. He asked the women if they would be willing to share their knowledge of traditional Japanese cuisine, which brought them to this moment, standing in the converted barn, with Thomas awkwardly explaining his request to Keiko and the assembled women. The initial shock on their faces gradually shifted into something more complex. Keiko glanced at Haruko, who seemed to be suppressing what might have been either laughter or tears. Several other women whispered to each other in rapid Japanese, their expressions confused but not hostile. Finally, Haruko stepped forward to respond. She explained in her careful English that sushi was indeed a traditional food, but it required specific ingredients, most of which did not exist in Wyoming. Ocean fish, particular varieties of seaweed, specially prepared rice, wasabi root, pickled ginger. Thomas listened to the list of impossibilities and nodded slowly. Then he asked a different question. Could they create something similar using what was available? Could they adapt their traditions to this new place? Teach the ranch hands about Japanese culture, even in its modified form? The question hung in the air, and Keiko suddenly understood what he was really asking. He was offering them a chance to be teachers instead of prisoners, to share instead of simply receive. He was acknowledging that they possessed knowledge and skills worth learning, that their culture had value beyond the war that had consumed it. April 20th, 1946. The kitchen in the ranch house had been transformed into an unlikely classroom. Keiko, Haruko, and 5 other women stood at the large wooden table, while Thomas, Buck, Jim Patterson, and 3 younger ranch hands watched with genuine curiosity. Eleanor Calloway had provided ingredients from the ranch stores, and the women had spent 2 days preparing what they could. The adaptation of traditional sushi to Wyoming resources had required creativity that bordered on invention. The rice had been the easiest part. Eleanor had rice in her pantry, though the short-grain variety preferred for sushi was impossible to find. The women made do with what was available, cooking it carefully and mixing it with a solution of vinegar, sugar, and salt that approximated the traditional seasoning. Keiko remembered her grandmother's precise movements when preparing rice. The way each grain should be respected as a gift. She tried to bring that same reverence to this improvised version, even knowing it would never taste quite right. The fish had required more innovation. Buck had spent a day fishing in the mountain streams, returning with a dozen rainbow trout. The women cleaned and filleted them with skills learned from coastal childhoods, their knife work precise despite the unfamiliar species. Ocean fish had different textures and flavors, but fish was fish, and these mountain trout were remarkably fresh and clean-tasting. Yuki had suggested smoking some of the fish first, combining Japanese and American preservation techniques into something entirely new. The most creative adaptations involved the traditional accompaniments. Without nori seaweed, the women used tender lettuce leaves from Eleanor's cold-frame garden. Without pickled ginger, they pickled radishes and carrots, using techniques that predated the war, creating bright, sharp flavors that cleansed the palate. Without wasabi, they experimented with horseradish from the root cellar, grinding it fresh and mixing it with a touch of mustard powder. The result was hotter, less refined, but it served a similar purpose. As the women assembled the various components, they fell into a rhythm that transcended language. Keiko shaped rice into small oblongs with hands that remembered the motion even after years away from home. Michiko laid delicate pieces of trout across the rice, adjusting each piece until the presentation satisfied her sense of balance. Haruko arranged the pickled vegetables in patterns that pleased the eye as much as they would please the palate. The act of creation became meditation, a connection to skills and traditions that the war had tried to erase. The ranch hands watched in fascinated silence. They had expected something strange, perhaps unpalatable. Instead, they were witnessing artistry. Jim Patterson, who had butchered countless cattle in his decades on the ranch, recognized the precision and care in the women's knife work. Buck noticed how Keiko's movements had the same focused grace he had observed in her horse grooming. Thomas saw his mother watching with tears in her eyes, moved by the sight of these women creating beauty from limited resources, maintaining dignity through craft. May 3, 1946. The sushi experiment had been successful beyond anyone's expectations. The ranch hands had eaten cautiously at first, then with genuine appreciation. Thomas had declared it the most interesting meal of his life, and Jim Patterson had requested that the women teach them more Japanese cooking. For a brief, precious time, it seemed that cultural exchange might soften the hard edges of their situation. Then the photographs arrived, and everything shifted once again. Colonel Mitchell brought the newspapers herself, her face grave. Life magazine and the Saturday Evening Post had published extensive photographic essays documenting the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The images were stark, unflinching, showing devastation on a scale that defied comprehension. Entire cities reduced to flattened wastelands, shadows of human beings burned into concrete, survivors with injuries that seemed incompatible with continued life. The women gathered around the publications in the barn's common area, their faces reflecting growing horror as they absorbed each page. Keiko found herself staring at an aerial photograph of Hiroshima, taken months after the bombing. She tried to locate familiar landmarks, the castle, the rivers, the districts where her family had been visiting. Nothing remained recognizable. The entire city had been erased and replaced with a nightmare landscape of ash and rubble. Her aunt's letter had described the destruction, but words could not convey what these photographs showed. This was where her parents and brother had died. This was the weapon that had ended the war. This was what human beings had done to other human beings in the name of victory. Haruko sat with her own set of newspapers, reading accounts of the firebombing campaigns that had preceded the atomic attacks. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, dozens of cities systematically destroyed by incendiary bombs designed to create firestorms in residential neighborhoods built primarily of wood and paper. The statistics were numbing. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions homeless. The article quoted American military officials defending the strategy as necessary to end the war and save American lives. It also quoted Japanese survivors, describing nights when the sky itself seemed to be on fire. The women's reactions varied as they confronted these images. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. A few became angry, demanding to know why Mitchell had brought such painful material. But most simply tried to process the magnitude of what they were seeing. Yuki finally received confirmation about her family in Nagasaki. A follow-up article listed neighborhoods that had been completely destroyed. Her family's district was among them. The uncertainty that had tortured her for months resolved into the terrible clarity of confirmed loss. That evening, Buck found Keiko sitting outside the barn, staring at the Wyoming sunset. She held one of the newspaper pages, creased from repeated folding and unfolding. He sat down at a respectful distance, saying nothing. After a long silence, Keiko spoke in halting English. "Your brother," she said. "He died fighting my country." Buck nodded slowly. "At Guadalcanal," he confirmed. Keiko's voice was barely above a whisper. "I am sorry." Buck looked at her, this young woman who had lost everything, and found he believed her. May 18, 1946. Spring had fully arrived on the Wyoming prairie, bringing warmth and the impossible green of new grass. The landscape's transformation seemed to mock the women's internal turmoil. Colonel Mitchell had announced that repatriation procedures would begin within the month. Transportation would be arranged to ships bound for occupied Japan. The women would finally be allowed to return home. The news should have brought relief, even joy. Instead, it brought a crisis that kept the women awake through long nights of whispered debate. Keiko lay on her cot, listening to the conversations happening in small clusters throughout the barn. The fundamental question being discussed was simple but profound. What did home mean now? For months, they had endured captivity, with the assumption that eventually they would return to Japan and resume their lives. But the photographs and letters had shattered that assumption. The Japan they had left no longer existed. The cities were ruins. The families were dead or scattered. The country itself had been occupied by the same American forces that now guarded them in Wyoming. Haruko had been researching conditions in occupied Japan through newspapers and Red Cross reports. She shared what she learned with the other women in their evening gatherings. Food was scarce, with widespread malnutrition and even starvation in some areas. Housing was critically limited, with millions homeless. The economy had collapsed, and inflation had made currency nearly worthless. Women faced particular dangers in the chaos of occupation, with reports of assault and exploitation. The women returning from American captivity would also face social stigma. They would be viewed as failures, as soldiers who had surrendered rather than die for the emperor. The conversations grew more intense as the reality sank in. Yuki spoke of having no family to return to, no home to reclaim in destroyed Nagasaki. What would she do there? Live in a refugee camp? Search for distant relatives who might or might not have survived? Michiko, whose medical skills had flourished working with Eleanor in the ranch house, questioned whether she could bear to return to a country where she would be seen as tainted by association with the enemy. Several other women voiced similar concerns, their words tumbling out in the safety of darkness and shared uncertainty. But others argued, just as passionately, for return. Japan needed everyone who could contribute to rebuilding. Running away to stay with former enemies, no matter how kind they had been, was shirking their duty to their nation. They owed it to those who had died to help create something better from the ashes. One woman, Tomoko Hayashi, spoke with particular conviction. Her entire family had died in the Tokyo firebombing, but she felt their deaths demanded that she return to honor their memory by helping rebuild what had been lost. Keiko found herself unable to decide. During the day, working with Rosie in the stable or helping with spring planting, she felt a strange peace in Wyoming. The routine had become familiar, the people had become something approaching friends, but at night, guilt gnawed at her. Was she choosing comfort over duty? Was she abandoning her country when it needed her most? June 1st, 1946. Colonel Mitchell stood before the assembled women with official repatriation documents in hand. The moment had arrived for them to confirm their intentions and begin the process of returning to Japan. The transport would leave in 2 weeks, carrying them to San Francisco, then across the Pacific to Yokohama. She asked each woman to step forward when her name was called to acknowledge her understanding and acceptance of the repatriation order. The first 10 names were called. 10 women stepped forward without hesitation. But when Keiko Yamada's name was spoken, she remained motionless, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Colonel Mitchell paused, looking at Keiko with raised eyebrows. She repeated the name. Keiko took a deep breath and spoke in careful English that she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. "Colonel Mitchell, I request permission to make a statement." The colonel's expression shifted to surprise, but she nodded. Keiko stepped forward, and Haruko moved to stand beside her. Then Yuki joined them, then Michiko, then 7 others, 11 women in total, standing together in a line that separated them from their fellow prisoners. The barn fell absolutely silent. Haruko spoke first, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to say. "Colonel, we have discussed our situation at length. We understand that we are prisoners of war, and that repatriation is the standard procedure. However, we wish to respectfully request permission to remain in the United States rather than return to Japan at this time." The words fell like stones into still water, their ripples spreading outward into stunned silence. Colonel Mitchell's professional composure cracked momentarily, her mouth opening slightly in disbelief. The other women in the barn began speaking rapidly in Japanese, their voices rising in shock and confusion. Some sounded angry, others bewildered. Tomoko Hayashi stepped forward, her face flushed. She spoke in Japanese, her words sharp. "You would abandon our country? After everything you choose to stay with the enemy?" Haruko responded in Japanese, her tone respectful but firm. "We are not abandoning anything. We are choosing to survive, and perhaps to heal. The Japan we return to does not want us. We would be burdens at best, outcasts at worst." Colonel Mitchell raised her hand for silence. She needed to understand the situation before it escalated further. She asked Keiko to explain their reasoning. Keiko spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. She explained that many of them had no families to return to, no homes, no means of support. She described the reports they had read about conditions in occupied Japan. She spoke about the stigma they would face as returned prisoners. But more than that, she tried to articulate something deeper. Here in Wyoming, they had been treated with unexpected dignity. They had found purpose in work, had been allowed to contribute and learn and grow. They had been given a chance to become more than just defeated soldiers. The request was unprecedented, potentially impossible. But it was also heartbreakingly sincere. Thomas Calloway, standing at the back of the room, found himself nodding slowly. These women had earned the right to choose their own futures. June 10, 1946. The week following the unprecedented request had been consumed by urgent communications between Colonel Mitchell, her superiors in Washington, immigration officials, and State Department representatives. The legal complexities were staggering. The women were technically enemy aliens, prisoners of war without legal status to remain in the United States. But they were also human beings making a desperate plea for a chance at new lives. The bureaucratic machinery ground slowly, while the women existed in an agonizing limbo, uncertain whether their request would be granted or denied. Word of the situation had spread beyond the ranch to the surrounding community. The Cheyenne newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Japanese Women Prisoners Request to Stay in Wyoming." The article was surprisingly sympathetic, focusing on the women's work contributions to the ranch and their tragic losses. It quoted Thomas Calloway extensively about their character and the transformation he had witnessed. The story was picked up by newspapers in Denver, Salt Lake City, and eventually reached the national wire services. Public reaction proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Letters began arriving at the ranch, at Colonel Mitchell's office, and at the Wyoming governor's mansion. Some expressed outrage that enemy prisoners should receive any consideration beyond basic humane treatment. Writers pointed out that American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific occupation, that Japanese atrocities had been extensive and brutal, that charity began at home with returning American veterans. These letters demanded immediate deportation of all Japanese prisoners. But other letters told a different story. Church groups, particularly those involved in missionary work, wrote in support of the women. Local families who had met them through community outreach programs vouched for their character and sincerity. Eleanor Calloway took matters into her own hands. She contacted Reverend William Harrison of Cheyenne's First Methodist Church, where she had attended services for 40 years. Reverend Harrison was known for his progressive views on social justice and his powerful sermons about Christian duty to help the downtrodden. Eleanor asked him to visit the ranch and meet the women before making any judgments. The Reverend agreed, arriving on a Thursday afternoon with his wife Margaret, who taught English to immigrant families in Cheyenne. What they found surprised them both. The women were working when the Harrisons arrived. Keiko was in the stable with Buck, learning how to treat a horse's hoof abscess. Michiko and Eleanor were in the garden, preparing soil for summer vegetables. Haruko was tutoring two younger ranch hands in basic Japanese phrases while they taught her American slang in return. The scene was one of integration and mutual respect rather than the sullen captivity the Harrisons had expected. Reverend Harrison spent 3 hours speaking with the women through Haruko's translation, asking about their faith, their losses, their hopes. He left convinced that supporting their request was not just compassionate, but morally necessary. The following Sunday, Reverend Harrison delivered a sermon titled, "The Parable of the Good Samaritan in Modern Times." He drew explicit parallels between the biblical story of helping one's enemy and the situation of the Japanese women. The sermon was controversial, inspiring some parishioners to walk out while moving others to tears. June 25, 1946. The decision arrived from Washington in the form of a classified telegram to Colonel Mitchell. After extensive deliberation involving the State Department, War Department, and Immigration Bureau, the government had reached a compromise position. The 11 women who wished to remain would be reclassified from prisoners of war to displaced persons. They would be released from military custody, but would need to secure individual sponsorships from American citizens or organizations. These sponsors would assume financial responsibility and vouch for the women's character. If sponsorships could be arranged, the women would be granted temporary residency with the possibility of applying for permanent immigration status after 2 years. The conditions were daunting. Each woman would need to find an American family or organization willing to take legal and financial responsibility for her. They would need to secure employment and housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. They would be subject to regular monitoring by immigration officials and could be deported if they violated any terms of their residency. But despite the challenges, it was a chance. It was more than any of them had dared hope for. When Mitchell announced the decision, the 11 women who had requested to stay stood in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had been granted to them. The response from the local community exceeded all expectations. The Calloway family immediately offered to sponsor Keiko. Thomas explained that she had proven invaluable in working with the horses and that the ranch could use a permanent employee with her skills and work ethic. Eleanor added that Keiko had become like a daughter to her, filling a void left by her son's death in ways she had not anticipated. The Harrisons offered to sponsor Haruko, recognizing her language skills and education as assets that could serve their church's outreach programs. Dr. Robert Hayes, the physician who had supervised Michiko's medical work, arranged sponsorship through Cheyenne General Hospital with the intention of helping her pursue nursing certification. Within 10 days, all 11 women had secured sponsorships. Local families, inspired by Reverend Harrison's sermon and the newspaper coverage, stepped forward with offers of support. But the joy of acceptance was tempered by the pain of separation. The 26 women who had chosen repatriation would leave as scheduled. The women who had spent months together in captivity, who had supported each other through devastating losses and uncertain futures, would now part ways, perhaps forever. The final week before the repatriation transport arrived was filled with quiet farewells and promises to write. Tomoko Hayashi, who had initially been critical of those choosing to stay, approached Keiko on the last evening before departure. They sat outside the barn as the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomoko spoke in Japanese, her voice soft. "I do not know if you are making the right choice, but I understand why you are making it. Take care of yourself, Keiko-san. Try to find happiness here." Keiko felt tears streaming down her face as she bowed deeply to her friend. "Help rebuild our homeland, Tomoko-san. Make it into something worthy of those we lost." September 7, 1966. 20 years had passed since that impossible summer when 11 Japanese women chose to remain in Wyoming rather than return to their defeated homeland. Keiko Yamada Calloway stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she now owned, teaching her 14-year-old daughter Sarah how to prepare sushi, using the same improvised techniques she had first demonstrated to Buck Calloway 2 decades earlier. The rainbow trout came from the same mountain streams. The pickled vegetables came from Eleanor's garden, which Keiko had maintained and expanded after her mother-in-law's death 5 years earlier. Sarah's hands moved with the confidence of a girl raised between 2 cultures. She shaped the rice with practiced ease, while asking her mother about a letter that had arrived that morning from Japan. The letter was from Tomoko Hayashi, now Tomoko Suzuki, who had become a teacher in the rebuilt city of Tokyo. Tomoko wrote regularly, maintaining a correspondence that had lasted 2 decades. Her letters described Japan's remarkable recovery, the economic miracle that had transformed the devastated nation into a thriving modern country. But they also described a different kind of transformation, a shift in values that Tomoko attributed partly to the influence of returning soldiers who had experienced American culture during their captivity. Keiko read portions of the letter aloud while Sarah worked. Tomoko described teaching her students about the importance of cultural exchange and international understanding. She had recently attended a conference on Japanese-American relations where she spoke about the unexpected kindness shown to prisoners during the war. Several other women who had been repatriated from American camps had attended the same conference, sharing similar stories. They had become, in Tomoko's words, ambassadors of reconciliation, living proof that former enemies could find common ground. The 11 women who had remained in America had followed diverse paths but maintained close connections with each other. Haruko had become the director of Reverend Harrison's International Outreach Program, helping hundreds of refugees and immigrants navigate American society. Michiko had earned her medical degree and now ran a clinic serving immigrant communities in Denver. Yuki had married an engineer and raised 3 children while working as a translator for the State Department. Each woman had built a life that honored both her Japanese heritage and her American present. Buck Calloway walked into the kitchen, his hair now gray but his smile still warm. He stole a piece of pickled radish from the preparation table, earning a mock scolding from his wife. Their marriage had surprised some in the community when it was announced in 1949, but most had recognized what had been obvious for years. The ranch hand and the former prisoner had found in each other a shared understanding of loss, resilience, and the possibility of unexpected love. Their relationship had become a symbol of the broader reconciliation between their 2 nations. Sarah asked her mother the question that every generation must ask about the previous one's conflicts. "How did you forgive them, Mom? How did you stop seeing them as the enemy?" Keiko paused in her work, considering her answer carefully. She thought about that first winter, about Buck's simple gift of paper and pencil, about Thomas's absurd request to teach cowboys how to make sushi, about Eleanor's black-eyed peas on New Year's Day.